Hey everyone, John here. Welcome back to another tutorial. Again, in After Effects, I've used Sapphire and Continuum together extensively with a few After Effects effects to create this look. And I've always wanted to do a nice pulse explosion, so it was fun to experiment with these effects. So go ahead, download the project file, and I'll walk you through it. Okay, so we're going to walk through this pretty quickly. It's a pretty detailed setup, and if you have any questions, just leave a comment, and I'm more than happy to go into further detail. So I've rendered out a full resolution proxy for the main comp, just to make things work a little faster, because there's lots of effects in here, and it did get a little slow, even on my system, which is fairly powerful. So let's go into the main comp, and we'll start right at the bottom. I'm just going to turn off my proxy. And let's start at the footage comp. Now, you won't have this footage. This is I think it's a 3D render. It's quite a nice 3D render of a warehouse and just a little camera push in on that. And, you could replace this with a similar shot. You could even get a still image and just put a couple of scale keyframes on it just to have that similar kind of movement. Obviously, you wouldn't have the, perspective and parallax, but I don't think that matters. So that's my footage. There's no other effects on that layer, and it's in a pre-comp. Now, to this, I've applied 3 effects. The first is Sapphire hotspots, just to crush the levels a little bit, give it a bit of contrast. The next is BCC plus Smoke and Fog. I'm going to turn that on. Now, it gives it a nice smoky look, but you may notice this. See how the smoke is not in front of the beams? And that's because inside of BCC Plus, inside of the pixel chooser, I've actually enabled depth map ML. So if we just turn on the view mask matte, it's actually using a depth map to control where the smoke is positioned. And that way I can have the smoke in the background and not have it in the foreground, which is so handy. If I turn it off, see, we get smoke everywhere. And not only does that make it look too smoky, it also makes it look very flat. So by using depth map ML, it gives us a lot more depth. So when you're using the pixel chooser, don't forget to check out depth map ML. So that's my smoke. And I've also got BCC Color Link, and we're going to come back to that. I've used Color Link extensively in this project, and it relies on sample layers, and we haven't actually looked at how I've set those sample layers up yet. So we'll come back and look at Color Link in a moment. Okay, now above that, we have the logo tracked comp. So let's just open that up. And in here, we have the footage. And to the footage layer, I've applied Mocha Pro because I wanted the logo to feel like it was integrated into the shot. And to do that, I've tracked the footage, and I've applied that track data to the logo. If we just turn the footage on, it's sitting beautifully in the shot, looking very natural. Let's have a quick look inside Mocha Pro. Now, you could use Mocha AE for this if you don't have Mocha Pro. It's a little more flexible using Mocha Pro, though. So all I've done is just use the X-spline tool, created a simple spline around this section here. And if I just select that layer, in my case, I did turn off shear. So I just translation, scale, and rotation, and just done a simple track forward. And that gave me that. And you can see I've positioned the planar surface around approximately where I want the logo to go. Save that. It's not going to save it here. And inside of Mocha Pro, I've clicked Create Track Data and chosen the Transform option. And I've applied that to a null and clicked Apply Export. So there's my null, hit the U key, there's my keyframes, and I've just parented the logo to the null just by doing that with the parent pick whip. And the reason I do that, and I've explained this in tutorials before, is because that allows me to keep the keyframe separate from the actual logo itself. So I can move the logo around and still have it track correctly. So a really simple use of Mocha Pro there, just to integrate the logo into the shot. Okay, so let's just close that up, come back to the main comp. Now I have applied a couple of effects to this, curves and BCC Color Link. So just turn those off. And you can see I've added a few keyframes for curves. Just going to turn that back on. Also need to turn off the footage here. We don't want that. And you can see with the curves, oh, well, there's actually a couple of opacity keyframes. So the logo fades in. As the explosion happens, the logo fades in. And I've just used curves just to knock back some of that brightness of the logo. So if we turn curves off, got the logo fading up. You can see it's quite bright, but with curves turned on, just knock back some of that brightness. Obviously, when you're creating something like this kind of look, you're adjusting, tweaking, maybe something's too bright, so you've got to go in and work out a way to make it less bright. So there's never really, like a step-by-step system that I use. I'm always jumping back in and making adjustments. So sometimes it's quite hard to unpick these kind of projects. So that's curves and a bit of opacity. And once again, Color Link. And we'll come back to Color Link. You can see that's linked to logo UltraZap PI, which we haven't looked at yet. Just turn that on. You can see it already goes quite bright. So you can see actually, just as a quick sneak peek, you can see how that's changing color based on how the logo with the UltraZap and PI is changing color. Okay, we'll come back to that. Let's take a look at Day for Night. And that's made that quite dark. Let's turn the footage back on. Aha, so we've got quite a nice moody look now. A bit of light still coming through the windows, of course. And we've got BCC plus Day for Night and Color Link. So turn off Day for Night. It's way too bright. So this makes it nice and moody. All I've done for this is just darkened up the moonlight color. By default, just reset that, it's fairly bright. So I've just darkened that up and I've just adjusted the preserve highlights, just increased that to 100 just to keep some of the highlights. So Day for Night, logo tracked and footage gives us that look. Let's quickly just jump onto volumetric light. You can see we have these nice lights at the top of the factory here, or the warehouse. And I wanted to give these some volumetric lights. So we just open that up. That's just the footage. It's in a pre-comp. And it's going to close that one up. And I'm going to turn off these effects. Let's walk through this effect by effect. I'm going to turn off that. So I've masked this out just to make sure that we're only including the area that has the lights. And I've used hotspots. So Sapphire hotspots again. Nice quick way to crush down those levels. And apart from a few little highlights here and there, we've basically just got the light source from those lights. Now to that I've applied Set Matte, After Effects' Set Matte, and you might have seen a little change there. The reason I've used this, and I've used the logo as the matte, the tracked logo, and you'll see why. Let's have a look. Let's turn on logo tracked. Okay, so I'm going to turn it off. So without Set Matte, the lights are in front of the logo, and we don't want that. We want the logo to occlude that light. So by using Set Matte with an inverted matte, I now have the logo in front. And when we turn on S-rays, that becomes even more obvious. See that? So if I turn that matte off, then we've got the lights in the background, sitting in front of the logo, which is supposed to be in front of them in Z-space. So that just occludes that. And you can also see with that S-rays how we've got this beautiful smoky volumetric light. And with S-rays, once again, just using atmosphere. I've talked about this in many tutorials, just to give it a bit of smokiness and looking really beautiful. And a bit of color link after that. And that's once again using the explosion. So if I just turn that on, you can see how that changes that based on the color of the explosion. If we just move back to where we really see the explosion, that's where it's, because we haven't actually looked at it yet, but just a little sneak peek there where the explosion's really colorful, using color link to colorize that layer. Very nice. And as I mentioned, we'll take a look at color link again in a minute when we've had a look at some of these other layers. Okay, so let's just turn on these other layers. And we are still seeing a little bit of that logo there because that's obviously occluding that light as we just looked at, but that gets hidden by these other layers. So we'll look at these next. This is logo tracked UltraZap PI. So let's double click to go into that. Now I've got a proxy enabled. Let's have a quick look while that's turned on. So we've got this beautiful UltraZap electricity, lightning, drawing around the logo. And we've got some really nice particles from particle illusion coming down, dropping down, and bouncing off the floor. Very nice. We'll just turn that off. Actually, we'll just do this one first. And let's take a look. It's going to bring that back to full. All right, so just turn my masks on. So what I've done here is I've gone into Illustrator and I've opened up my vector logo file and I've copied it, and then I've come across to After Effects and I've pasted, and that's given me all of the masks, okay? So you've been able to do this in After Effects forever, but I needed the masks because UltraZap in After Effects can use those paths. You can see under Mode, UltraZap AE path. So this is one of the benefits of using UltraZap, Sapphire UltraZap in After Effects. And what that means is I can have the lightning, the UltraZap, moving around those paths, moving along those paths. And in order to do that, we have settings for the main bolt animation. You can see loop here is set to 0.5, so it's just moving slowly. And under secondary bolt animation, down here, we have secondary loop, and I've got -5. So we've got the zap moving in different directions, which I think makes it look a little more interesting. So if I just come back and just turn on the proxy, just to make this a little faster, especially on the inside here, you can see how we've got that zap moving along the path because of the loop, and it's moving in different directions for primary and secondary. Now, in order to fade that in, I've put a couple of keyframes on here. So we've got bolt width and bolt length. So bolt width is set to 5, and there's also secondary as well. So we don't want to see it at first. We want the explosion to happen, and then we want that, pulse explosion to affect the logo and, infuse it with electricity, I guess. So the explosion happens, and then the bolts start to grow with the bolt length from 0. So they grow as they're looping around that logo. And once the explosion starts to diffuse, the electricity hangs around for a moment, and then thanks to bolt width keyframes, it just fades out. I thought it fading out was better. I don't think it looks very good to animate the length in, then out to 0 again. Now, a little bit of animation down is good to about 0.3 here or something, but not completely down to 0 because it just looked a bit weird. So animating the bolt width, just having them fade out like that, I thought was a little more effective. I love UltraZap, and it looks particularly good on logos. So that's the logo tracked UltraZap. So I created that and I pre-rendered it, and then in the UltraZap PI comp, you can see I've used particle illusion. And if we just open up particle illusion, which of course is available in Continuum and as a standalone. Here what I've used is this image effects preset. This is logo burst. I've used this before in tutorials where you can use a logo and have it turn into particles and explode. And the trick with this is to make sure that your emitter is only around the size or slightly larger than the actual logo. Otherwise, you're going to have all of these extra particles on the outside. Even though they're black, they're still going to slow down your render. So keep that nice and tight. And turn off the motion blur there. And you can see down here, just move down a little bit. I've used a deflector. There it is there, the deflector. And just by clicking on plus deflector, and I'm just going to use my spacebar and my hand tool. As the particles fall down, they hit, just to zoom in here a bit, they hit the deflector and they bounce up and break up like that. So I've just moved the deflector into a place that kind of matches the floor just by eyeballing it. And you can see with the deflector, you can have it have them move more randomly by adjusting the randomness. You can have them break as they hit the deflector. So it's pretty flexible and it can look, quite convincing. And with a bit of motion blur, as they fall down, you can see they bounce like that, which is really nice. If we come back to the main comp, so we've got the logo fading in. You can also see the color link there as well, but look at that in a moment. And we've got the particles falling down and bouncing off the floor. I did duplicate it just to brighten it up a little bit. And to the second one, I've used a bit of Ultra Glow and Sapphire rays. Not too much rays. I think if you use too much rays, it can look a little fake. But it's nice to have just a little bit of rays. You can see they're just sort of shooting off there, just in the brightest areas. Of course, with Sapphire rays, you can adjust the threshold. And, if I bring that right up, or right down, sorry, you get, way too much. That's what we want to avoid. And we're getting that, bit of brightness from the light there, which is still fine. I think that looks nice with that bit of brightness coming down from that volumetric light. Just illuminating that a bit more. So it's starting to come together, but obviously the explosion is the hero of this look. So let's take a look at that. We do have an adjustment layer above that, but that's to do with the explosion. So we'll just turn on the explosion, double click. Now I do have a proxy enabled, so mine is nice and fast. Yours might not be quite as fast, but it's fairly detailed. I'm going to come in, turn that proxy off, and let's dig down. So we've got this turbulent noise sphere at the bottom. Inside that, we have a turbulent noise layer, and this is After Effects' default turbulent noise, and it has the beautiful dynamic fractal type, and it's a black and white image, but I've used it as a matte for a white solid. So we just do that. It disappears. You can only just see that white. If we just change the background color just temporarily, you can see, there we go. So we do have an alpha channel there just to prove that. And above that, we have an adjustment layer with mirror. Got to turn that on. Now, the reason I've used mirror is because I wanted it to be seamless when using BCC Sphere. So that's turbulent noise. There's a little bit of animation on it. If we just hit E twice on the keyboard, you can see I've got a time expression, simple time expression on evolution. And it just gives us a little bit of evolution because you don't want it to be stationary. It's an explosion. You want it to be, I guess it's almost like smoke or electricity or something, but it's got to have that kind of motion. So that's why I gave it a bit of evolution. Make it look a bit more organic, a little bit more real. And I've used BCC Sphere. So I guess what I really wanted with this was it kind of like a bubble of energy blasting out from the logo. And I thought BCC Sphere would be the best thing to use for that. And you can see, because I made that alpha channel using the matte, we've got just this white, electricity, smoky looking fractal. And there's a couple of keyframes on that just for scale for BCC Sphere. So it just bursts out quite quickly with that initial explosion. And then it kind of lingers for a bit. It's almost kind of the last thing we see. And it kind of disperses as that scales up. So that's the turbulent noise sphere. It's going to solo that. There it is there. You can see I've applied a couple of effects, S quad tone and S rays. I used to always use tritone for my colorization, but I'm using things like quad tone a lot more now because you can see with quad tone, you've got two colors you can have sandwiched between white and black. And that way I can have just, a little bit more variation in the blue. If I just use tritone, it'd be a little flat. So that's why I use quad tone. So a nice electric blue with a bit of S rays just from the brightest areas. Once again, adjusting the threshold just to make sure that we don't get, too much going on. It makes that look really fake. So that sort of blasts out like that. Looking really nice. Might have been nice, actually, thinking back, to have a little bit more warp on that. So it moved a bit more like a bubble. You know how when you blow a bubble, it's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of, it distorts, and it's not, it's not a perfect, like a glass sphere. It actually is moving and distorting. And I think that could look quite nice as well, but I won't do that now. Above that, we have S lens flare. I'm just going to solo that. So Sapphire lens flare with UltraZap. So Sapphire lens flare is great, just gives us that initial burst of light. Just grabbed a preset for that. And so just once again, that initial burst of brightness, and then just fading out and scaling down. So scaling the widths down. And the mask is actually being used with the UltraZap, not with the lens flare. And if I turn that on, you can see why. So I'm masking out the UltraZap to only sit around the edges of the lens flare. If we come to the UltraZap and we turn the mask off, then we get UltraZap everywhere. And I've used one of my presets that I created that are available inside of UltraZap for this. I think it was the Palpatine preset that I used. So with that on, we're isolating the UltraZap to just the edges. And that'll be clearer why we do that when we look back in the main comp in a moment. And that's those two layers combined. Above that, we have a Sapphire Distort adjustment layer. And look at that. With a bit of S Distort, and I'm using as the lens the turbulent noise sphere, we get almost kind of like a 3D kind of look. I guess it kind of looks like a bubble, doesn't it? If we just turn off that, it looks almost 3D, doesn't it? Very nice. And that's the kind of look I was going for. Above that, we have polar displacement. So this is BCC plus polar displacement. And this is just displacing, this is also an adjustment layer. And this is just basically displacing everything below. So all it's really doing with the map source set to turbulent noise, which is just the basic turbulent noise comp, it's just displacing it slightly using that as a map. And if we just look over in this area here, it's just displacing it, offsetting it slightly and adding a little bit more detail. It almost kind of looks like, solar flares coming out of the sun, the kind of look that it's created. And I just liked it because I thought it just added a little bit more detail, made it look a little more complex without having to do too much work. It looks quite kind of nice over here as well. If we have a look here, see that? All that detail in there. So BCC plus polar displacement. Very nice. Now above that, we have the shockwaves. So these are really important. Let's just turn that on. So there's two shockwaves, shockwave A and shockwave B. And shockwave base is, once again, turbulent noise. But you can see I've made that quite big. This is 3840 by 3840, so quite big. Once again, evolution with the time expression. So just to have that evolving just a little bit of movement in there. So that's the shockwave base. And let me just, we'll go to the bottom one first. Okay, so here I've used, actually, no, let's look at the top one first. I think that's probably a good one to look at. So here is just using After Effects' circle effect. You can see I've set edge to thickness and animated the radius. So we get this ring. And I remember doing this for the first time. It must be 20 years ago when I worked at Foxtel. I worked in television. And I remember doing something quite similar using this exact effect. So it's still in there and it's still very useful. So that's created this circle and animated the radius, of course. Scales it up. Now I've duplicated that. And to the bottom one, It's almost identical, with circle. Made it slightly softer with the feather. So a little bit more feather, but also used S-warp polar. And look at that. Let me just turn that off. So there's S-warp polar, giving that some nice streaks, giving it a bit of a tail, I guess. And with circle on top of that, with stencil alpha chosen, we get this nice tail, which looks really good. And then the one we just looked at is placed on top, and we get this little tail coming off this initial ring, or fractal ring, like that. So that's shockwave A. Shockwave B is very similar. So very similar technique. So warp polar for the bottom one, circle. So a lot more feather this time. We've got a lot longer tail. A bit of bokeh lights, sapphire bokeh lights. And this is once again just to fake these particles. I like sapphire dust. I like bokeh lights for faking particles. Obviously, I like particle illusion in Continuum as well, but I use this particularly because it has the use source color option. If we just make that the default of 0, then we're going to get bokeh lights everywhere. But by using the source color, we only get it around the source pixels. And in this case, that's the shockwave base. You can see I've adjusted smooth source color. If I bring that back to 0, we get a much harder line. So we don't really get any of those bokeh lights outside. But by increasing this, if I bring it up even more, we get more and more of those particles, or those, they're not particles, but lights outside the outer edge. So I really like that. And I know I've talked about that particular setting in previous tutorials. So that's the base. And above that, once again, we have a ring slightly thicker, just using the After Effects circle effect like that. So out that comes. And combined, they look like that. Beneath bokeh lights, I did use a bit of S-distort, just to distort that as well. Okay. And for the lens, I've just used the shockwave base. So we have the outer ring and the inner ring. So it's a dual shockwave. And it's nice how you can use bokeh lights just to add a few little particles without having to do any work, really. So shockwave A, shockwave B, they sit above what we've just looked at. And you can see I've used Sapphire quad tone just to colorize that. What a difference that makes. And duplicated it, quad tone the same, just duplicated it and used the screen blend mode, which I've used for a lot of these, just to brighten it up. I'll often duplicate layers just to give them a little bit more, oomph. And above that, a bit of Sapphire Ultra Glow, just to give some overall final glow. And if we just come back and turn on the proxy, just to make that nice and fast, that's the explosion. Boom. And there's that BCC sphere, as I said before, so it's lingering a little bit, looking kind of smoky. I think probably what I would do if I did this again is just add a bit more movement to that, just so it's moving a little bit more as it's fading out. It just seems, it is evolving, but it just seems a little bit static. I'd like these larger wisps just to be moving a little bit more. But, overall pretty nice. And that just sits above everything. We just come to an area where we can see it, like that. And looking pretty nice, but notice how the background isn't being affected by the explosion, and that's why I use this adjustment layer. This has got Sapphire Warp Puddle and Sapphire Distort, so let's just turn those on. And I'm going to turn all of that off except for the footage. And I'm going to turn that back on and turn on Sapphire Warp Puddle. Aha. Okay, so here I've adjusted the amplitude, inner and outer radius, just to kind of match the size and speed of the initial explosion, of the actual explosion. And that's giving us these big, soft, warped rings. We turn the explosion on again. and we turn warp puddle off. That's without, and that's with. So we get that nice warping of the background, nice distortion. What a difference that makes. And I've just used Sapphire Distort after that just to add a bit more detail. So we get the initial big rings, then we get a bit of extra distortion using S-Distort. And you can see I've used as a lens the explosion. If I was to decrease the blur lens amount, we can add even more detail, and that makes it look a little glassy. So a little too much. But S-Distort, what a great effect. I mean, all of the distortion effects in Sapphire are so useful. So with the explosion on top, we get that look. So once again, I'll just take a little snapshot there, turn those off, and we'll just do a little comparison. See the difference? Very nice. You even get that, distortion on the edge there, because there's some pixels there that are being used by the S-Distort, and the warp polar is also the warp puddle is also slightly outside. So we're getting that kind of leading edge distortion, which is really nice. So we've got is all of this looking really nice. And above that, we have a little bit of sapphire dust. Once again, I do use sapphire dust and sapphire bokeh lights to fake particles. And here I've just used S-Dust. S-Dust is great because it isn't particles, it's very fast, and it also has depth blur, so it has depth to it, and it gives this particular shot a lot of depth. And all I've done is animated the field of view just to fake the explosion. See, I've got a couple of keyframes for field of view. And as I animate the field of view, it's kind of zooming in, which makes it look like the dust particles are kind of moving outwards, moving away from the explosion. And I've just distorted those a little bit using S-Distort. So you can see it gives them a bit of distortion there, makes them look like they've got a bit of motion blur, which they don't, but it just fakes that. And for that, I've used the turbulent noise. So the turbulent noise map there. And we just turn all of these on. And we just get a little bit of a blast of particles with the explosion. You can see on the outside here, these sort of particles. So that's the basic look. Let's just now quickly go back and take a look at some of the color link layers and just see how the layers that I just broke down for you are affecting those layers. Okay, so let's start at the bottom here. It's going to soldo footage. And I'll turn BCC plus color link on, and you'll see the footage change color slightly. You see it went slightly blue there. Now, the reason it's doing that is because as the sample layer, I'm sampling the logo. And remember, the logo starts with the UltraZap, so it starts blue, and then we get some particles falling off, which are a little purple. So by sampling that, if we just turn off the smoke, so we get a little bit of blue at the front. I'm just going to turn on the logo. So there's the blue that's being sampled. Remember, at the beginning, there's no blue because there's no UltraZap, so it just goes back to the standard unaffected footage. So a little bit of blue, and it goes a little more purple towards the end because we get a little bit of purple introduced into the particles. But it's not affecting the entire shot. Notice that? And that's because, as with BCC plus Smoke and Fog, I've also used the pixel chooser with depth map ML. And if I just turn on the mask matte, it's only affecting this area in the foreground, so in front of electricity, a little bit in the background. And of course, that can be controlled through using guided and using guide far and guide near, just clicking. So I want that to be guide far. And, I've got a guide near option here, just clicking in the foreground here. So I can control where the color link affects my shot based on the depth, which is super, super handy. Just going to turn that off. And you can see it there. So if I was to turn that completely off, then we get a lot more affected. And I don't really want that. So that's how it's affecting the footage. Now, when we have the logo tracked, I'll just solo that. So you can see it's kind of a purple color there. Here we're sampling again the logo tracked UltraZap PI layer. And once again, nothing at the beginning. When we get a bit of blue, we'll start to, as the logo fades in, we'll start to see it a little more blue. And towards the end, it goes a little more purple. And then it fades out. We're also affecting the volumetric light, as we've already seen. So with Color Link there, we're using the explosion this time. So the explosion is quite quick. So we'll see it very obviously around where the explosion happens. The lights will change color. If I don't do that, then the lights will stay white, which looks weird, right? You got that. You'd expect them to change color based on this huge, purple, pink explosion happening in the warehouse. So they change color, and as the explosion fades, then they go back to being just their boring old white color. And that's basically the technique for using Color Link. I won't show you any more layers because the tutorial is getting a little long, but preparing your sample layer and then applying Color Link to the layer you want to be affected by that sample layer and choosing it as the sample layer. So it's super easy, and I use it a lot when I'm compositing. So let's take a look at the final look once again. And it's pretty complex. I could have spent weeks just tweaking this, but of course you have to finish sometime. If you do want me to dive deeper into anything you've seen, please leave a comment. I'd be more than happy to dive right down deep into any of the settings. If you want to learn more about Continuum or Sapphire, visit borisfx.com, where you can also download a free trial. But for now, this is John. I'll look forward to seeing you in the next tutorial.